Minister Iswaran, Chairman Mr. N.K. Singh, distinguished guests and friends. Let me just make a few remarks so that we can get into discussion, which I'm sure would be much more interesting to all of you. But just to get us started, my key point is really that in the end, what matters most is the external markets. There are about 4 or 5 major cases of very rapid growth, growth which transformed the economies in a matter of 2 to 3 decades. And these are starting from Japan, followed by Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, and the latest one, China. In every one of these cases, the role of the external markets, the role of the exports is absolutely pivotal. And there are various ways to slice each of these cases, but if you take out the role played by the exports and the world markets, I think each of these cases actually really would collapse. It was in this sense very pivotal. I will submit that this remains true for India as well. One of the key factors today, I think, which is largely missing from the Indian economy is the scale on which our largest firms operate. In fact, in many of the sectors, we have simply no large firms or barely there. And the sector that comes to mind most immediately is the clothing industry, which in India consists of swath of very, very small firms. A simple comparison, in India, about 95% of the workforce in apparel industry is concentrated in small firms, which is less than 50 workers each. In China, about 70% or more of the apparel workforce is in large or medium firms. And of course, the Chinese large firms are much bigger than the Indian large firms. When it comes to scale, we simply miss out. But make no mistake, even in India, successful industries are those where large firms are present. You can look at auto, engineering goods industries, pharmaceuticals, software industry. Every one of the successful industries has large firms. And when there are large firms present, of course, small and medium firms do well also. And that one can see very readily in the productivity of the large and small firms. In sectors where large firms are present, productivity, the average labor productivity is significantly higher. I mean, so relative to the large firms, the medium and small firms also do very well. In firms, in industries, in sectors where large firms are missing, you see that the average productivity in small and medium firms also lags. And there's a good reason for it. The ecosystem is defined by the large firms. They are hooked up into the world markets. They are the ones which must paddle extremely hard to remain competitive in the world markets. And that kind of then at home defines the ecosystem. And they then, in effect, demand similar productivity levels from the small and medium firms, either as their competitors or as the firms to which the small and medium firms are suppliers of inputs. So I think that is very critical, and that is a lesson. I think there is something about which the private sector needs to worry as much as the government government in terms of the policies that would foster facilitate the emergence of large firms. But the industry mindset also in India, I think, particularly in these employment-intensive industries, which are now so critical for India, has been defined by the small-scale industries reservation, stringent labor laws, etc. And so that even though today, actually, there is no small-scale industries reservation, and at least in some states like Gujarat, you can find very flexible labor laws as well, you don't see the large firms emerging in those sectors. I think that really needs to change. This is part of the reason I've been advocating very much and and pushing for some coastal employment zones. Also, that ties into the fact that if you are large, you are going to operate in the world markets, and that of course means a coastal location is going to generally help. And that again is something you can observe in the history of all the rapidly expanding economies that I mentioned earlier. Now, there is some skepticism today, both coming from what is going on in the global economy and what is going on in the technology field towards this sort of export-oriented, global economy-oriented model. On the global market side, the fear is that there is some protectionist backlash in some of the countries, which might render invalid the export-oriented market, which propelled the growth in Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, and China. I would submit actually that today the global market is so large. After all, the base matters. Global market today, even after very slow growth or even actual decline in the export market for a couple of years, it is still a $16 trillion market. India's share in that market is just 1.7%. It is tiny compared to that Chinese share. This is only merchandise exports. I'm not even counting services, which is another $5 to $6 trillion. And to that, compare that India's economy today in total is 2 trillion, of which less than 1 trillion actually is the goods market. So you're comparing a $16 trillion market to something that is less than $1 trillion market. And not to mention the fact that if you actually conquer the world markets, you automatically would conquer your domestic market. That is, if you're competitive in the global markets, you will certainly be competitive in the domestic market as well. So I think going forward, even if protection on the margins impacts the size of this market, it remains an incredibly large market. And therefore, I think what matters a lot more is not what happens in that market, but what we do domestically here to ensure that we become globally competitive. I think in the end, our global competitiveness is going to determine what we can do in the global economy. On the technology side, certainly there are challenges ahead, but at the same time, that challenge can be overstated. In the end, because something can be done in a lab sort of conditions, because something can be done at the innovation level, doesn't necessarily mean that it will result in commercial success. Surely, in a lot of the sectors, this is happening. Commercial successes are also happening. But in some of the sectors where actually we ought to be present big time, even at the laboratory stage, things are not quite there. Clothing industry is clearly one of those. The process of stitching two pieces of cloth is still far from the capability of robots to do. Some experiments I have seen, but nothing that is anywhere near commercialization. So still clothing industry is likely to be done for at least next 10 to 15 years by the human hands, and that is a window that is long enough for India. So again, I sort of return to the theme that in the end, what we do here is what is going to matter the most. And this is where I hope our industry will also think a bit harder. What I have noticed actually in my 2.5 years at the NITI Aayog is that there is huge kind of, tendency, not just on the part of us, the policymakers, but also on the part of the industry to look to the domestic market largely. And that, of course, leads to the demands for and sometimes grant of it for protectionist policies that secure the domestic market for the domestic industry. And sometimes we end up providing such high level of protection, and that may take the form of trade protection or of subsidies. That in the end, you make it profitable for even smaller, less efficient manufacturers to get into the market, and the market that emerges then is a collection of small firms, each of which becomes competitive in the domestic market, but really at the end of the day is not competitive globally, and the scale that is actually required ultimately to become globally competitive is not achieved. So I think we do need to remain open, open the economy further. And the industry needs to think a lot more in terms of scale than it does. Domestic market is not the ultimate. The ultimate really is the global economy. That is where we really need to be in action. That 1.7% share in the global export market for goods has to rise up to at least 4 or 5%. If we could get even there in the next 10 years, that would certainly do wonders. Just as a last point, let me say that both I agree on the education. The minister has made a lot of very good points on education and skills. We need to do that. In India, actually, particularly in the area of education, both school education and higher education, we really have got a very long way to go. Indeed, the quality of education has been declining. We need to arrest that, reverse that, particularly at least the foundational learning is very important. Even if skills are to be imparted, absent foundational learning, even skills cannot be imparted. So I think that remains a huge challenge. The present government, I'm very glad, has made some changes in the school education policy, requiring the performance of the students to be measured, as opposed to what we had under the Right to Education Act originally. That is a hugely important step, but we have to continue further reforms in that direction. On higher education, we need to build top-class universities. I think, Singapore offers a very good example. China offers a very good example. We need to start building up at least, 2 or 3 world-class universities, which then can also lead not only the innovation and entrepreneurship in the country, but also build up the necessary background for more serious research in which India has been